So 1.4% in the third quarter, nothing surprising. You've called it 1.4%. But while the economy has grown, Azar, it's not good to see that the industrial part of this economy is still contributing negatively.
Very much so. For 3 successive quarters now, we've had negative quarter-on-quarter growth in the manufacturing sector. One shouldn't be surprised. You had the strike in the platinum mining industry, which meant that those mines in the platinum industry called on fewer goods and less equipment to supply them in the first 2 quarters, and then in the third quarter we had the strike in the metals industries. So yeah, that's one of the outcomes, but it is sad because that is, of course, one of government's objectives to try and reindustrialize the country. But what we are seeing is progressive deindustrialization.
We saw this recalculation or revised figure of minus 1.6% in the first quarter. Remember, it was sitting at 0.6%. Is there anything significant or worrying that this figure has been revised to such a vast difference?
Well, I think the main thing that I draw from this is that the impact of the platinum mining strike was that much worse than we were led to believe initially.
Yes.
And it also means that we will struggle that much more to get to even the 1.4% downwardly revised forecast growth for the whole of 2014 people have been looking at. But yeah, all it tells us is that the economy hasn't been doing very well.
You mentioned this year's full-year figure, but let's just talk about the projections for next year. 2.5% says the Treasury and the Reserve Bank as a forecast for next year. It seems more unlikely when you're seeing that companies now have been told to cut their electricity usage by 10%, which essentially means they produce less. What does this mean for next year?
Clearly, I think the Reserve Bank has been at pains also to suggest that even its 2.5% growth forecast has more of a risk of disappointing on the downside than being surpassed. Having said that, you've got to bear in mind that this year's been awful.
Yep.
And so next year one will be comparing against an awful year for the year before. So if there's any sense of return to normality, we could still get to 2.5% growth. But you're quite right, electricity outages, the possibility, and for me it's one of the big risks, is of a strike in the public sector as a result of government's attempts to try and reduce the budget deficit and reduce the growth in compensation of public servant wages. Then, you know, and the other big risk is of a global economy turning out to be even softer than the downwardly revised forecast for that as well now, which would mean lower growth in exports. The fall in commodity prices, and may be very nice from a short-term point of view that we'll be paying less for petrol, but the flip side is that we're going to be getting less, and we are getting less for in dollar terms for our gold, platinum, coal and other such exports.
So what are the growth drivers here? I mean, normally you would say, well, let's go ahead, cut interest rates, increase government expenditure, perhaps lend out more credit to households. It appears that none of those options are really available now, are they?
They are not really available because households are already up to their necks in debt. Not that it's got any worse, but it is quite high. And so and that's not a sustainable way of getting the economy moving. The only proper way of getting this economy moving faster is to undertake structural reforms to improve the educational system, to render workers more productive, to try and diffuse tensions within the labour market, and to encourage small business, to deregulate and that kind of thing. But of course, there's a whole sector of the political spectrum that sees such policies as being so-called neoliberal and anti-establishment.
We always end off with the one big question, jobs, Azar. We've got the unemployment stubbornly at that 25% mark. This is nowhere close to a growth rate to absorb any jobs.
There's absolutely no way you're going to get unemployment down with numbers such as these, especially over the past year. What I've seen is that we have been having, for the last 6 years actually, growth in employment in the formal sector being about 1% less than the GDP growth rate, which means that with a 1.4% growth in the economy, you're going to get less than 0.5% growth in employment. And yet you are seeing the number of employees increasing by 2 to 3% per year simply because of new entrants coming at the job market. There's no way that you're going to cut unemployment under those circumstances.
All right, before you go, if there is a silver lining, what would it be as we approach next year?
The silver lining is a return to some semblance of normality, which can enable business to just gradually pick up a little bit of momentum. But even with that silver lining, I think that the 2.5% growth rates that are being put out are on the assumption that things return to normal and we don't have a hullabaloo about strikes and that we don't have too much disturbance from electricity outages or a slowdown in global growth. And that's about the best. We're seeing a limit of 2.5% on the upside.
Dr. Azar Jammine, thanks very much indeed from Econometrics.